Hi guys, some things can be difficult to understand, but reasonable people, when provided with the information, will accept them and move on. Jim Allister, the head of the extremist Traditional Unionist Voice Party in Northern Ireland, isn't a reasonable person. I've covered this guy before, and he's a nasty individual. He claims to care about ordinary people, but only if those people suit his criteria. So he stood up in the House of Commons on Monday and challenged the Prime Minister to answer a question that the Prime Minister isn't qualified to answer about the BBC. Have a listen.
Mr. Speaker, if those of us in this House, at this distance, can feel the pain of the dastardly attack of a year ago, we can but imagine the indelible imprint on the people of Israel and Jewish folk across the world. Can I ask the Prime Minister, has he a view on the fact that our national broadcaster, the BBC, refuses to call those who perfected this heinous terrorist attack, refuses to call them terrorists, and likewise now with Hezbollah? What is the government's position on that, and what representations have they made?
The government's position is that Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist organisations, and we stand very firm on that and rightly call them what they are.
Okay, what a stupid question. You want the government to police speech? Is that what Jim Allister is calling for? He wants the government to intervene with the BBC and tell them what to do. So this is an interesting question. So why does the BBC not refer to Hamas, for example, as terrorists? Well, let's hear from the BBC themselves.
Government ministers, newspaper columnists, ordinary people, they're all asking why the BBC doesn't say that the Hamas gunmen who carried out the appalling atrocities in southern Israel are terrorists. The answer goes right back to the BBC's founding principles. Terrorism is a loaded word which people use about an outfit they disapprove of morally. It's simply not the BBC's job to tell people who to support and who to condemn, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. We regularly point out that the British and other governments have condemned Hamas as a terrorist organisation, but that's their business. Our business is to present our audience with the facts and let them make their own minds up what they think. As it happens, of course, many of the people who've attacked us for not using the word terrorist have seen our pictures or heard our audio and made up their own minds on the basis of our reporting. So it's not as though we're hiding the truth in any way, far from it. Any reasonable person would be appalled by the kind of thing we've seen. It's perfectly right to call the incidents that have occurred atrocities, because that's exactly what they are. We don't take sides. We don't use loaded words like evil or cowardly. We don't talk about terrorists. And we're not the only ones to follow this line. Some of the world's most respected news organisations have exactly the same policy. But the BBC gets particular attention, partly because we've got a lot of critics in politics and in the press, and partly because we're rightly held to an especially high standard. But part of keeping to that standard is to be objective as it's possible to be. That's why people in Britain and right around the world in huge numbers watch, read and listen to what we say every single day.
So any reasonable person listening to that would come to the conclusion, yes, the BBC doesn't use the term terrorist because it's a loaded term. Because if you were to ask people in Palestine, is Israel a terrorist state, they would say yes, while people in Israel would describe Hamas as terrorists. So whatever side you're going to be on, you're going to refer to the other side that you're fighting against as terrorists, in the same way that people in the Unionist community that Jim Allister represents would describe the IRA as terrorists or Republicans as terrorists, while people in the Republican community would describe certain people that Jim Allister doesn't have a problem with as terrorists as well. So the term is not useful. especially if you're a mainstream broadcaster. And this is why the BBC is held to a very high standard, because it maintains a very high standard. Does it always maintain that standard? Of course not. But generally, that's what it works towards. Now, as I said, a reasonable person would take away from that here is why the BBC does not use that term. Now, Jim Allister is wasting parliamentary time asking the Prime Minister to answer this, because the Prime Minister is not qualified to answer this question. Is he calling for the government to police speech, to tell the BBC what they can and what they can't say? You know, these are people who claim to be advocates for freedom of expression, but they want the government to tell the BBC what language to use. Then they don't care about free speech, and people like Jim Allister don't care about the people affected by terrorism. It's all my team against your team. We're the good guys and you're the bad guys. And he wants the mainstream media, like the BBC, to be on his team. And it's good that the BBC are not picking sides, that they understand these loaded terms, and they're not going along with the government if the government use these terms, or they're not going along with a political party. And this is a good standard to use if you're watching news reports. Like the likes of GB News don't have these types of standards, as we know, but other outlets as well. We tend to hear it, for example, when it comes to migration or asylum seekers. The BBC generally refers to people crossing the channel as asylum seekers because that's what they are. It doesn't describe them as illegal migrants. This is the type of language you'll hear, sometimes even on Sky News, but generally on right-wing channels like Talk TV or GB News. So I've been informed, you've been probably informed about why the BBC doesn't use the term terrorist. I don't know if I was going to say Lee Anderson. I was going to say Lee Anderson. No, I don't know if Jim Allister will actually see this video, or if he's heard from this report from the BBC. But if he did, do you think it would change his mind? Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.